The good times are coming to an end. My name is Freeman, and I've known Guy since I was 11 years old, which is more than 10 years. Guy was one of my best friends. I still miss him very much. In 2016, Chris Hall asked if I would write something for a tribute anthology that he and Justin Park were putting together, and I was happy to accept. Previous autumn, I'd had an idea for a story after reading Guy's The Black Druid, and while it wasn't wholly inspired by that, it certainly contained some of the moods and atmospheres and elements that I wanted to capture too. Guy absolutely loved this story, and I hope you enjoy it too. And while I can't promise any penis-munching dwarfs, just one word of warning, it does get a little bit racy at times, so if you are easily offended, fuck off. Redfields Lane. Oh my God, Louise said, I can see an arse. An arse? Asked Wendy. What's it doing? For some reason, perhaps the drinks they'd had before they left for White Swan, Helen found this hilariously funny. What's it doing? Bouncing up and down. What's it like? Pale, flabby, spotty, an arse. Wendy was leaning forward from the back seat to peer out at the car they were approaching. Sure enough, there it was, and the motion of it through the rear window left no doubt as to what was going on. Dirty bastards, Helen said as they drew alongside. Honk your horn. Louise did so, and Wendy turned her head as they drove past. In the darkness of the other car, she thought she saw a face looking out at her, and the idea that the man might be looking into her eyes as he thrust himself into his partner left her feeling rather wicked. Now they were past the car, and the lane ahead was empty and unlit. On either side, fields and trees. The autumn sky above was smoky, dark grey. Though the town was only a handful of miles away, its lights weren't visible. The place was eerie and remote. That had been the idea, of course. When the costumed crowds at the White Swan had thickened to a point where they couldn't hear themselves think, Helen had suggested they liven up their Halloween night out with a drive into the countryside, up past the stone circle at the Flax Farm and out along Redfields Lane. Clueless, Wendy had asked, what's so good about that? Helen had rolled her eyes, though in truth Louise didn't know much about the history of the places either. Some vague stories she might have heard in the schoolyard. She let Helen take over, but didn't know how much she was making up as she went along. The stone circle is where the druids used to perform their sacrifices. It's supposed to be haunted. There was a murder a few years back where a guy was supposed to have been possessed after visiting there. And Redfields Lane is just beyond that. The whole area is really weird. It's reckoned to be cursed. By someone called Redfield, Wendy asked. Newman, a landowner in the 17th century, found out his wife had been shagging around his entire estate staff. He went out and slaughtered as many of them as he could find, chopping them up, ripping them apart with his bare hands. Some people even say he was tearing at them with his teeth, setting his hunting hounds on them. And he wouldn't have stopped, but a mob got together and hanged him. That's where the place gets its name. The fields were said to run red with blood. Before he died, he put a curse on the whole estate. They hadn't found Flax Farm. The country roads that they reached soon after leaving the pub were nearly all unlit, unnamed, and, it seemed, aimless. Louise, as the driver for the night out, was still mostly sober. Wendy was laughing to herself on the back seat, and Helen was keeping up an almost constant commentary on the journey, which, considering the featurelessness of the countryside, was no mean feat. At one point, when they'd realised they weren't going to find the farm and the stone circle, Wendy interrupted to say, isn't this where all the doggers hang out? The what? Louise asked, and regretted it as soon as the others conspired in laughter against her. God, Louise, you're so naive. Are you sure you weren't raised in a convent? Doggers, Helen explained. You know, those kinky buggers who have sex in cars with strangers. If they can, added Wendy. Most of them are just sad middle-aged men hoping to get some action. If they're lucky, some fat couple will turn up and let them shag a wife. Otherwise, we just stand around watching others do it and wank over the windscreen. It's like driving through the monkeys at a safari park. There's even an old church out here that the police have to visit every night because it's never locked and people going in it to, you know. Louise risked a glance back at her as she slowed the car for a junction, each road of which promised more darkness and more fields. You seem to know a lot about this. Of course she does, laughed Helen. She's a filthy bitch. Too right, agreed Wendy. I'm proud of it. They'd passed the first car not long after that, and Wendy had been proved right. Helen began to press her about how she knew so much about it, and Wendy told them, brain-drunken laughter, about how she'd visited various dogging locations around the town to watch people at it. Ever see anything worth seeing? Louise asked her. Wendy waved her hand. Very rarely. The best was this one couple, absolutely fucking gorgeous and totally naked, just standing at the side of her car in a lay-by. She was sucking him off. I swear I got myself off right there and then in my car just watching them. Louise drove in stunned silence until Helen's laughter prompted her to join in. But the laughter soon died away. It seemed increasingly at odds with the loneliness of the night. Does Pete know? Helen asked. Something flitted across the lane through the headlights, low to the ground and blood red. A fox, perhaps, though it looked much bigger. It was gone too soon to be certain. Not a chance. I'd never tell him that. He'd have us down there every night and filming me with them so we could stick videos on the internet. I can't believe Pete's like that, Louise said, forcing herself to join in the conversation to distract herself from watching the darkness beyond the headlights, waiting for something else to run across the lane or towards the car. He really doesn't look the type. What are you trying to say? Wendy cried in knockout rage, but Helen waded into the battle against her. He's pretty drippy looking, you must admit. I can't deny it, Wendy replied. I'm not with him for his looks. I'm not sure what I'm with him for, dickhead. Not like Louise's fellow. Now, Mark's pretty hot. Louise blushed and was glad the others couldn't see. Of course he is, she said. I only settle for the best. I'd have a threesome with you both, Wendy said. He'd probably let you, Louise admitted. I'd best not tell him. Lucky cow. Ask him for me. A pale, twisted shape leapt out of the darkness, but it was only a mass of tree roots that the headlights had illuminated. Eyes that glimmered from the pitch-black void beyond could have belonged to any number of nocturnal creatures, thought Louise, though the idea unsettled rather than reassured her. Redfields Lane, Helen said, reading the long weathered sign at the roadside. We're here. And not long after that, they saw the other car. Trees were stooping to touch branches across the lane, at this point little more than a bumpy, pitted track. There was a small passing place on the roadside and a hatchback car tidily parked up. The driver's door was open and the interior light on. There was an arm, unclothed as far as they could see, reaching out from the doorway, but still unmoving. Somebody was lying across the front seats, but they saw no one else until Louise drove slowly alongside. Her first thought was that there was a couple fucking on the roadside. The person lying face down in the dirt was only clothed on the top half, and the one crouching over them was completely naked. But it wasn't human. She registered this with a sickening twist of her gut. It was more dog than human, and yet not even that. It was the size of a person and completely hairless, but when it raised its head and turned to look over its shoulder at the car, at the women within, the face was canine, black, soulless eyes, a sleek head, a long muzzle full of long teeth, and the whole face was stained dark with what must have been blood. Oh shit, Wendy said in an oddly toneless voice. Fucking move it, get the fuck out of here. Louise did. Her body responded before her mind had a chance to think. She urged the car forward, fixed her eyes on what little she could see of the road ahead. An instant later, Helen shrieked and something hit the side of the car, hard. For a heart-stopping moment, Louise feared the impact would be enough to tip the vehicle over, but of course it was nowhere near it. Beyond the reach of the headlights, darkness reigned. Louise drove as fast as she dared, but the badly rutted surface of the road threatened to damage the car and jolted them roughly. She heard Helen asking, "Is it still following us?" And from the back seat, Wendy said, "I don't know. I don't think so." They reached a fork in the road and Louise barely slowed as she took a left turn. The lane narrowed even further and high unruly hedges lined the verges. She wondered if the other road would have been a better choice. There was another sign at the side of the road, but a quick glance showed her only an ancient and desolate church. "What the fuck was it?" Helen asked, and when the silence became too suggestive, Louise spoke. "It looked like a huge dog." "It looked nothing like a dog, and you know it," Helen snapped. "There was a woman in the car. I saw her as we were driving past. She was dead, and the man it had pinned to the ground, it was eating him." Through her tears, Wendy spoke up. "That's not all it was doing." "What do you mean?" Louise asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know. "It was fucking him," Wendy cried and broke into uncontrollable sobs. Louise's mind was spinning. She felt faint and tried not to think of anything except driving, of hopefully getting the hell away from here, back to the main roads, back to town. They could worry about it then, about informing the police, about what they may or may not have seen, once they were safely surrounded by lights, by noise, by people. The car juddered, and the lights went off. Only for a second, but more than enough to suggest that things might not be that easy. Wendy was hyperventilating. Helen was grim-faced and silent, picking at her nails. Louise watched the lane unfolding in the headlights. Eyes flashed from the darkness between the trees, but she daren't look at what might be out there. They came to another junction, and this time Louise went straight across. 50 yards later, they reached a road sign. Redfields Lane. "What the fuck?" Helen said. "Surely we should be away from here by now." "I'd have thought so," Louise admitted, "but it's a long way. We'll be away from here soon." "What?" Wendy asked, leaning forward. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Louise said. "Everything's going to be all right." And then they saw the hatchback again. "Louise," Helen said quietly, "we're back where we started. That's the same car." "We can't be," Louise replied, but they were. She slowed almost to a standstill as they approached the hatchback. If there'd been more room on the lake, they didn't have to ask what she meant, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. They drove slowly past, looking at the car, front doors hanging open, a woman's arm limp in the cold night air, the broken, mutilated body of a man pressed into the mud. They drove on until they reached the fork in the road Louise remembered from earlier. She spoke out loud. "I went right, but stopped almost immediately." "What?" Wendy asked, leaning forward to see. "What's wrong?" Just a branch of the road." "Then why are we stopping? Keep going." "I can't," Louise said. "We're going to have to move it." Though reasonably slender, the branch was long and twisted and weighed down by dead foliage. It might be easy enough to move, but there was no way she could safely drive over it. But moving it would mean getting out of the car. "You stay here," Helen said, "and be ready to move. I'll go." And with only the briefest of hesitations, she let herself out into the night. Watching her through the windscreen seemed as unreal as staring at a cinema screen as some unbearably tense movie played out. Helen stepped carefully along the lane, her feet becoming entangled with the outermost reaches of a fallen branch. The trees overhanging the lane shook in the breeze, and some unidentified creature of the night cried out, a chilling and eerie sound. Helen reached down and took hold of a branch. Then she paused, looked back towards the car. Washed out by the headlights, Her face was a white mask of fear. She wasn't looking at the car, Louise realised, but above it, up into trees. And then something heavy landed on the roof. Louise didn't flinch. Fear held her immobile. Wendy had no such trouble. Her nerves already frayed, she pushed open the door and fled from the car out into the dark. Louise was opening her mouth to yell a warning when the creature attacked. It leapt from the roof of the car onto Wendy's back and knocked her onto the roadside. Its momentum caused it to roll a further few yards before it found its balance and turned back to face its latest prey. Helen was back in the passenger seat. "Louise, let's go," she urged. Wendy wasn't moving, either dazed or knocked unconscious. She was too far from the car. Helping her would be madness, would most likely mean certain death for all of them. The creature was approaching her fallen body slowly, hunched over so that it almost, but not quite, walked on all fours. It glanced from Wendy to the car repeatedly, as though deciding where to direct its attention first. Louise pressed down on the accelerator, and the roar of the engine was matched by a roar from the creature. Again, she wondered what the fuck it was, and again she found no natural explanation or even comparison. As the car picked up speed, the thing threw itself at the vehicle, but it was too late. It collided with the rear corner and bounced off. Louise kept her eyes on the road, but asked, "Is it following us?" "No," Helen said. "It's gone back to Wendy." The road twisted and turned. She couldn't drive as fast as she would have liked. Surely now they were heading back towards town, but she wished it was in a more direct, more obvious fashion. Trees bent low over the car, branches scraped across the windows, long, bony claws. Another crossroads. "Fuck it," Louise said. "I have no idea where we are." Helen pressed her face against the glass. "Is that the lights of town? I can't see through the trees." For a moment, Louise was afraid she was going to get out for a closer look. She started off again, turning left. The road was little more than a sucking, muddy mess at this point. She could feel the wheels alternately sticking and sliding. "Louise," Helen said, looking back the way they'd come, "I think it's following us." Louise glanced in the mirror as she ground the gears. There was something out there on the lane, sure enough. She urged the car on and slid dangerously to the side of the road, bumping up against the grass verge. Helen screamed. "It's okay," Louise said through gritted teeth, and pressed down as hard as she dared on the accelerator. The creature was close enough now for her to see it clearly in the rear-view mirror, all eyes and teeth and long, dangerous limbs. The car jumped forward all of a sudden, and they were making headway again. If Helen had indeed seen the lights of town earlier, they were now entirely hidden from view, or had never been there in the first place. The car raced on into a darkness worse than ever. Louise drove as fast as she dared, terrified each time they hit a bumpy patch or pothole that the car would give up the ghost and leave them stranded. Another crossroads. She made a turn, and soon after that, they found themselves back where the nightmare had all started, at the hatchback car on Redfields Lane. Helen was crying, shaking her head. Louise's heart felt gripped in ice. They were never going to get out of here. Every move they made would bring them back here until they gave up the fight and waited for the creature to find them. She wondered idly if the petrol in the tank or the hours of darkness would run out first. Then she made a decision. "Come on," she said, reaching out to grip Helen's hand. "We're not done yet." They set off once more through that cursed countryside, through the trees and darkness between them that might conceal horrors infinitely worse than the ones they had already seen. Several times Helen asked her what she was doing, but Louise didn't answer. She just drove and watched the night carefully. Even the little she could see of it was looking dreadfully and ominously familiar now. The whole thing felt like a nightmare from which she might never wake up. If every turn they made brought them back to the starting point, then Which one would bring her to the church? A light rain started as she saw the sign and turned off the lane towards it. Its black bulk clawed at the night. There was a token car park, a square of mud that wouldn't have been large enough for much more than her own car. She remembered Wendy mentioning that the church was often used as a location for those meeting up for anonymous encounters. "Louise," Helen asked as Louise stopped the car, "what are we doing? Why are we here?" Louise left the lights on, directed at the path leading to the porch of a church. "Come with me," she said. "We'll be safe inside. It's our only hope." No, I'm not getting out. I'm not going out there." Louise gave her one last look. The other woman was rigid with fear, arms crossed over her chest, staring fixedly at the dashboard. "Be safe," she told her, and left the car. The church reared up over her. Its crumbling Gothic structure and the stubby graveyard around it offered no comfort, but perhaps the building itself might provide shelter. The police visited each night. She remembered Wendy saying, and she wanted them to find her here. She only hoped it would be that simple. Somewhere behind her, trees shook and something clawed its way across the lane. But she refused to run and just kept walking steadily up the church path. It was only a breeze, she told herself, and watched her shadow loom large in the headlights and fall upon the church doors. Running felt like an invitation for something to chase her. She should stay calm and not panic. As her hand closed upon the cold iron latch, the lights went out as something passed in front of them. And in the car, Helen began to scream.